Welcome to Declassified Deep Dive, where unredacted files reveal hidden truths. Let's uncover the secrets. I'm your host, Raj, and each week we explore a new secret deep dive.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today, folks. Going deep on Operation Northwoods.
Ooh, that's a fun one.
It is, and we've got a ton of sources to pull from. We've got declassified documents, information from Wikipedia, and some YouTube breakdowns from historical hindsight. Into the Shadows, Johnny Harris, and the infographic show.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild ride, I think, considering all the stuff that they were thinking about doing.
Oh yeah, it's pretty intense stuff that thankfully never actually got put into action.
Thankfully.
So before we get into like all the crazy what ifs, let's start with the basics. What exactly was Operation Northwoods?
So in the simplest terms, Operation Northwoods was a plan, like a proposal cooked up by the U.S. Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the goal was to create a justification for invading Cuba.
So this wasn't just some fringe idea. This was coming from like the top military brass.
Oh yeah, this was top-level stuff.
Right.
And the way they wanted to justify this invasion was through what's called a false flag operation.
Okay, so like making it look like Cuba was the aggressor?
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to stage attacks, make it seem like Cuba was responsible, hoping to sway public opinion in the U.S. and abroad and gain international support for a U.S. intervention.
That's wild. I mean, and all this was happening on March 13, 1962, when the proposal was handed over to Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. But to really understand why they even considered this, we need to look at what was going on between the U.S. and Cuba back then.
Right, so think about 1959, the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro coming to power, and then aligning with the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War.
Yeah, the Red Scare was in full swing. Everyone was freaking out about communism spreading.
Exactly, and the U.S., you can imagine, was particularly worried about a communist country being so close. They saw it as a direct threat. There were also concerns about potential Soviet military bases in Cuba.
And of course, there was the whole Bay of Pigs invasion fiasco in 1961, which was a huge embarrassment for the U.S.
Yeah, the Bay of Pigs really ramped up the tension, and it led to Operation Mongoose, which was a CIA program specifically aimed at destabilizing Castro's regime. So you had a lot of covert action, a lot of tension already brewing.
So basically, you're saying that within that context, Operation Northwoods was born.
Exactly.
But what did this plan actually entail? What kind of false flag operations were they thinking about?
Well, some of the ideas were pretty outlandish. They actually considered staging attacks on the U.S. Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba.
What, you're saying they were going to attack their own base?
That was the idea. They talked about faking sabotage, instigating riots. That would look like they were started by Cubans even sinking a U.S. ship.
Oh, wow. So kind of like the USS Maine incident, which was used to justify the Spanish-American War.
Exactly. They were looking to evoke that same kind of public outrage.
Man, this is already pretty shocking, but it gets even crazier, right?
Oh, yeah. It definitely does. They also considered orchestrating a so-called communist Cuban terror campaign within the U.S. itself.
Hold on, you're saying they were willing to terrorize American citizens?
That's what the documents suggest. They talked about planting bombs in U.S. cities harming Cuban refugees, basically creating this climate of fear to make it look like Cuba was attacking the U.S.
That's a whole other level of deception. What else did they have in mind?
They also wanted to harass U.S. ships in the Caribbean and potentially shoot down a drone aircraft, disguised as a Cuban MiG fighter.
So basically fabricating an incident that would make Cuba look like the aggressor on the international stage.
Exactly. It's giving serious Gulf of Tonkin incident vibes, which of course was used to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
I mean, these are some seriously disturbing proposals.
And I think perhaps the most chilling idea was a plan to stage the downing of a civilian airliner.
A civilian airliner? Are you serious?
That's horrifying.
It is. The plan involved making it appear as though Cuba had shot down a plane full of college students. I mean, it was truly a monstrous idea with the potential for significant loss of life, both American and Cuban.
It's hard to believe that someone could even think of such a thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like something out of a dystopian novel. I know it's wild, but there it is laid out in official government documents.
So what happened next? Did this plan ever go into action?
Fortunately, no. President John F. Kennedy rejected the Operation Northwoods proposal.
Thank goodness for that. But I can only imagine that didn't sit well with the military leaders who had proposed it.
You're right. It didn't. Kennedy's rejection created a lot of friction between him and the military establishment. Some viewed him as too hesitant to take a hard line against Cuba.
I can only imagine the tension that must have caused.
Oh, yeah. There are accounts that suggest General Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was a major proponent of the plan, was later removed from his position because of this disagreement. But there are other sources that say that he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in 1963. So it's a complex situation, as is often the case with history.
It's rarely black and white, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But Kennedy's rejection of this plan, it really highlights the importance of checks and balances in government. It's a reminder that we need leaders who are willing to stand up to powerful institutions when it's necessary.
Absolutely. And it also underscores the potential dangers of unchecked military authority and the vital need for civilian oversight.
This all happened just a few months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
That's right. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy again faced intense pressure from the military to take aggressive action against Cuba.
But he held his ground and chose diplomacy and negotiation over a potentially catastrophic war.
Yeah, he did. And thankfully, a nuclear confrontation was averted.
Okay, so Operation Northwoods was ultimately shelved, but its legacy is pretty significant, wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt. I mean, the declassified documents that revealed this plan, they fueled a lot of distrust in the government. They raised serious questions about government transparency and accountability.
And rightfully so.
Yeah.
If they were willing to consider such extreme measures, what else might they be hiding?
Exactly. It's a question a lot of people have asked in the decades since. It's a reminder that even in democratic societies, there's always the potential for abuse of power and secrecy, and that can really undermine public trust.
It makes you think about the ethical implications of false flag operations and government deception. How can a society function when it can't trust its own leaders to tell the truth?
It's a fundamental question, isn't it? This incident, even though it never actually came to fruition, it really underscores the fragile nature of trust in any government and the importance of holding those in power accountable.
So what does all this mean for our listeners today? Does this change your view of the Cold War? How does this make you feel about government transparency?
Those are great questions to ponder. What stands out to you about this story?
We'd love to hear your thoughts on our social media channels.
Because this isn't just a historical curiosity, It's a story with profound implications for how we think about power and truth and the responsibility of those who govern.
Before we wrap up our deep dive for today, let's connect back to our main sources one last time. Wikipedia gave us a pretty solid neutral overview, a proposed false flag operation rejected by President Kennedy aimed at justifying a U.S. invasion of Cuba.
Right, and then we have the YouTube explainers, each offering a different perspective. Historical hindsight kind of explores what might have happened if the plan had actually been implemented.
Yeah, and Into the Shadows really emphasizes the long-term impact of Operation Northwoods on public trust and the rise of conspiracy theories, even though it never actually happened.
Johnny Harris does a great job setting the stage, explaining the Cold War context, the fear surrounding communism, and the perceived threat from Cuba.
And the infographic show provides a really detailed breakdown of the various false flag proposals, using visuals to really drive home the shocking nature of the plan.
It's a sobering reminder that the capacity for deception and manipulation exists, even at the highest levels of government.
And finally, we have those declassified documents themselves, which are available online. They provide a chilling glimpse into what might have been.
It's interesting, these sources offer different perspectives on Operation Northwoods. They agree on the basic facts, of course, but some, particularly those YouTube channels, present various viewpoints on the motivations and implications of the plan.
Right, and we acknowledge those differing viewpoints without necessarily endorsing any particular stance. Our goal is to present the information in a balanced and informative way so that you, the listener, can draw your own conclusions. It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. The key takeaway here is that the U.S. government seriously considered a plan to deceive its own people and potentially instigate a war with Cuba based on fabricated pretexts.
And it's a reminder that this type of thinking, this willingness to manipulate and deceive for political ends, it's not limited to any one country or ideology. It's a universal human problem that we need to be constantly vigilant against.
So if Operation Northwoods was never implemented, what other covert operations might have been considered, but never came to light? What does this incident say about the potential for government overreach, even in a democracy like the United States?
Those are excellent questions, and ones that we should all be asking.
It's a bit unsettling, to say the least. But hey, that's why we do these deep dives, right? To shed light on the hidden corners of history and encourage critical thinking about the world around us.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, but only if we use it wisely.
Well said. A huge thanks to you for joining us on this deep dive into Operation Northwoods. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit unnerving.
And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic and draw your own conclusions.
Until next time, keep diving deep. Man, it really is mind-blowing to think that this was even, like, on the table as a possibility.
I know, right? It really makes you question what goes on behind closed doors.
But let's talk about the sources we use for this deep dive for a second. We have those declassified documents, right? They're like a window into this whole crazy scheme.
They really are.
Yeah.
And they've been the foundation for so much of the discussion and debate around Operation Northwoods.
Yeah, for sure. And then you've got Wikipedia, which gives us that solid, neutral overview of what went down.
It's helpful to have that baseline understanding before you dive into the, more nuanced interpretations.
Absolutely. And speaking of those nuanced interpretations, let's talk about those YouTube explainers. Historical hindsight really got me thinking about the what-ifs.
Yeah, the what-ifs are always so fascinating. Like, how could history have unfolded differently if they had actually gone through with it?
Seriously, it's like a chilling alternate history lesson.
Yeah.
And then there's Into the Shadows. They really highlight the long-term impact of this whole thing, even though it never actually happened.
That's the thing. Even though it was just an idea, the fact that it was even considered has had this lasting effect on public trust in the government.
Totally. It's fueled so much skepticism and contributed to all sorts of conspiracy theories.
No, absolutely. And then there's Johnny Harris. He's just so good at explaining complex historical events in a way that's like engaging and easy to understand.
Right. He really brought that whole Cold War context to life, explaining the fear and paranoia that surrounded communism at the time.
Yeah, it really helps us understand why some people might have been so receptive to the idea of taking drastic measures against Cuba.
For sure. And we can't forget the infographics show. They break down those false flag proposals in such a visually compelling way.
It's one thing to read about these proposals in a document, but it's another thing entirely to see them presented visually, with all the shocking details.
Like, come on, blowing up their own ships, attacking American cities. It seems almost unbelievable.
It does. And yet there it is in black and white in those declassified documents. It's a reminder that even in a democracy like the United States, the potential for government overreach and manipulation is very real.
It really makes you wonder what else might be hidden away in those government archives.
Right. If they were willing to consider this, what else might they have been capable of?
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important point, the lasting impact of Operation Northwoods.
Even though it was never carried out, it raised some serious ethical questions, about deception, about government power, and the importance of holding leaders accountable.
Absolutely. And those questions are still so relevant today in a world where misinformation and manipulation are everywhere you look.
So what do you think, listener? Does this story change your view of the Cold War at all? How does it make you feel about government transparency and accountability?
It's definitely a lot to process.
It is, but understanding history, even the unsettling parts, can help us navigate the present and the future.
I totally agree with that. We've got one more part to this deep dive. Stick with us. Okay, so we've really gone deep on Operation Northwoods, this wild plan the U.S. government cooked up to justify an invasion of Cuba. It's crazy stuff.
Absolutely. I think it really makes you realize how much we don't know about what happens behind the scenes.
It does make you wonder, what else is hidden away in those government archives, right?
Right, exactly. But hey, that's what these deep dives are all about, pushing those boundaries and getting people to think critically.
For sure. Operation Northwoods, even though Kennedy shot it down, raises so many questions about power and truth and accountability.
It really does. Like, how do we make sure something like this never happens again?
Right. What can we do to prevent these extreme ideas from even being considered in the first place?
Well, we need those checks and balances, strong ones. And transparency in government is crucial. A free press that isn't afraid to hold those in power accountable.
And an informed citizenry, too, right?
Yeah.
People who are paying attention and willing to ask the tough questions.
You got it, because at the end of the day, it's up to us, we the people, to demand transparency and hold our leaders accountable.
It's like Operation Northwoods is a warning, a reminder that freedom isn't a given. You have to fight for it.
I agree. We can't get complacent. We need to stay informed and question everything, especially when it comes to war.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Operation Northwoods, I think the key takeaway is that we need to be aware of the potential for government overreach, even in a democracy.
We need to be active participants in our democracy. Demand that transparency, hold our leaders accountable.
History shows us time and time again that power left unchecked can be a dangerous thing.
And knowing that is powerful in itself, understanding the mistakes of the past can help us avoid making them again.
That's a great point. So to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
Remember, history is never really over. It's still unfolding, and we're all part of shaping its course.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of Operation Northwoods. Until next time.